I'm going to start off by going over the different types of blades you might have or can use. We're not using scissors in this class, just blades. These are the replacement bits for a Swan Morton scalpel, the number 11. This is the scalpel itself, and this is a retractable version. This is one of the most inexpensive and regularly used types. You can see here that it's got this nice grip for you to hold on to. Again, a scalpel is designed to be used in surgery, so you can use it all the time. This one is the retractable one. Its one failing is that it wobbles a bit and is not as steady when cutting as the solid state handle. That's just a matter of preference. Easier to store though and protect the blade, so you use them less frequently. And you can buy these blades in packages of about 100 for $10 or so. Very, very easy to use. This one is a circular cutter made by many different brands, but you see that this head swivels around, and these are marketed mainly for cutting circles and curves of that nature. I find that actually they're relatively difficult to use, and they're much more difficult to use for straight lines because of that swiveling head. I tend not to use this one at all, but if you have it, feel free to use it. I will, however, teach you different ways to approach circles with a straight blade. This one is a sort of disposable craft knife or box cutter. It has the locking mechanism here, very important to use that where it exists. The blades snap off in the end, but again, it also wobbles a little bit. As a tool for introductory stuff, very helpful, very easy. You can go ahead and grab one of these out of your garage. Just make sure that the blade is actually sharp, and you can use that. Make sure again to use the locking mechanism when necessary, as that is very important for your safety. This one is one of my favorite types. It's an NT cutter made in Japan. I had to purchase these through Amazon and they were sent to me. This one has a second tool on the back for punching. It's used in card making. But the nice thing about this tool is that they unscrew and then screw in for storage, so that both that awl point and the blade are protected, and also so that you don't cut yourself when putting them in. So I quite like this one, but again, this was a bit more expensive, maybe about $20. This is the NT cutter swivel head, which is the one I like to use most frequently. It again comes from Japan. You can see in this little paper cut I did how much I enjoy this particular knife. It's the one I use all the time. What's great about this knife is that it has a great deal of precision and an organic fluidity that is often absent from other knives. Again, much more expensive, had to buy it from Japan, another $25 or so, but holding it down by the head, it has a great angle and allows me to really get up close to what I'm doing while feeling very comfortable in my hand. However, you're not actually going to see me use this knife in the videos. You will see me use this one. This is a new knife that I have, and I've tried just about every one there is, and this one came out recently on Indiegogo. Replaceable blade head like that. Has a much greater length of cutting away from your hand than, say, the scalpel or the NT cutter. And I was using this one mostly during these videos to find out whether or not I like it. So this is not necessary for you to buy or use, but if you happen to have one, I'm surprised you're taking this class. You probably already know exactly what you're doing. So that's why I use this particular knife in the videos. Now let's talk about cutting mats. This one is an A2 cutting mat, self-healing. They often come in colors of green, like this one, which is A1. Doesn't matter the size so long as your paper will fit on top of it. They're self-healing, so when you cut into them, it doesn't really damage them any. You can buy them inexpensively at any craft store or online, but again, they're not necessary. If you don't have one and don't want to buy one, that's fine. I recommend you use something like this piece of box, cardboard, something just a little bit thick. You want something that will take your blade and not damage the table beneath. You could also use a dry, clean, non-oily cutting board if you wanted. Just needs to be a flat surface that will take the blade, because you're going to push through the paper, but you're not going to push deep into the mat. You could also use something like this, piece of card from an envelope. You again need something to protect your table and to accept the blade. Now let's talk paper. You don't need any special paper for this class. What you have in your printer will do fine. This is an example of the paper that I regularly use. It's watercolor paper. It's about twice as thick as regular printer paper. And it's not necessary that you have anything thicker for paper cutting. I just like a little bit more substance. Now this paper comes in A4 size, which is the metric size. Regular 8.5 and 11, 8.5 by 11 paper will do fine. You can see, however, that when you bend this paper, it just sounds a bit heavier and it is just a little bit thicker. Paper cutting, even when it's delicate, hangs together very well and it does not require thicker paper. But you may find that you like to do it on that. Don't go too thick. Card becomes very difficult to cut. This is the regular printer paper on which I printed out the templates that I've given you for this class. See, very flexible, regular printer paper. This is the practice sheet that we will get to. It too is just printed out on regular printer paper. That's the easiest way to get these together. And you see that the two of them together will have roughly the same thickness as this watercolor paper. Again, use whatever paper you've got lying around. No need to buy anything special, just don't go too thick. Welcome to your first bit of cutting. So first you're going to want to arrange the sheet in a comfortable way to you. Have your knife ready. We're going to work on this first row here. And you see these spaces. We're going to talk about positive and negative cutting as we go along. These are the two major types of cutting that you will do, and essentially how you will show the shape when you cut out the paper. The best way to cut is to hold your knife at a 45-degree angle to the paper so that you're really slicing through. Do not press down too hard. You're looking just to get a gentle glide through. You'll feel it if you're pressing too hard. The paper doesn't need very much. So experiment with different ways to hold your knife and different ways to press down, and sort of different comfortable angles for you to find what feels best. The knife should be an extension of your arm. What I've done here is cut the top two and then the bottom two of these first three boxes. So you cut the top and the bottom because you're going in the same direction, and you're always cutting towards you. This just makes it easier. Rather than turning the paper 4 times, you turn it twice. You could also use a cutting ruler, like this one here. Any ruler will do. This one is clear and has a metal edge, which helps with cutting. You'll see, though, that this is not necessary. You can go at a speed that's comfortable to you. Feel free to take your time with this. Make mistakes, that's what this practice is for. If you mess up entirely, feel free to print it out and start again. You'll find over time that it gets easier and easier to do the straight lines, and they just sort of glide along, and your pieces will pop out. This is important, so I'm going to go over again how to hold your knife. This is a good angle. You want it to be perpendicular to the page at about 30 to 45 degrees. Not like that or like that. You want to cut straight in like this. You'll feel it as it glides through how it's best to hold it. You can often hold at the corners if you need to go back and cut a little bit if your piece is sticking. Positive and negative space is very important to understand for paper cutting. This bottom box is what we call negative space, and this one is positive space. Positive space is created by cutting out 2 negative spaces around it. In this case, all the shapes are the same, so everything that is gray here is negative space that is cut out. and everything that is white is positive space, or what remains. All positive space in simple paper cuts must be attached to other positive space. Otherwise, you're just cutting out shapes that don't adhere together. So here, we're going to make 2 bars out of positive space by cutting out 3 bars of negative space. It can take a little bit of time to wrap your head around this, but once you start to understand, or simply remember that all the white bits should be connected, it becomes quite easy. Now, as you're going through this, I want you to do something very important. You need to check in with your body right now. See if how you're cutting things is comfortable, is the paper the right distance from you, and check that you aren't hunching over something and that your shoulders are not tense together. We have a tendency to try and hover over what we're doing, particularly at desks. And if you continue doing paper cutting for a long time, it can often be quite problematic for your back if you're not in a good position. So just watch what you're doing as you're cutting, because your body will get away from you sometimes. So as you follow around with these curves, they're very gentle and very easy. You don't need to do much except alter the way that your knife goes. When we get to circles, I'll talk about moving the paper around and how that works, but for these curves, it's very gentle. You just follow through to the end. You can go back and check to make sure you're doing well. Make sure that you aren't overcutting too much. Overcutting is when at the end of a line you cut farther into the positive space, the white bits of the paper, than you anticipated. There's always some type of overcutting. You just don't want there to be too much. In order for the piece of paper to come out, you want to be almost perfect, but there is a tiny bit more. If you ever get up real close to a paper cut, you will see this too. You will often make mistakes as I did here, and you can go back and clean them up and just slightly cut a bit more out to make sure that it's even. Nothing has to be perfect the first time round. Now let's tackle this last block, and this last block is much more curvaceous, if you will, and so this time it's a little bit harder to just follow your knife along the sweep of that curve. So again, go through, cut all the parallel lines as I mentioned before, and then just start on the interior curve and just follow it around for the first bit. And if you find that it's not comfortable to follow it around to this second bit of the curve, you can start rotating your paper. Again, follow this curve around for the first part, smoothly into the second curve, press down on your paper if you need to hold it, and then follow it around to the end. So from here, just watch what I do. If you have any difficulties, you can always put your finger up close by the knife to hold down the paper if that's giving you trouble. But you should mostly find a comfortable way using the techniques I've given you to do this cutting. So go ahead and finish out this last block, and I will see you in the next video. Alright, let's move on to this second set of shapes here on this second row. Now you should already have a great idea about how to approach these, having watched the previous video. So we're going to start with all of the parallel lines again, 1, 2, 3, and then with the next set. And I've speeded this up a bit, so don't worry about it if you're not going nearly this fast. For this one, you want to start the curve in the middle at the top where it's almost flat, and go around to one side, and do the same again, cutting towards you from the other side. And then when it pulls out, very nicely spherical. Now let's approach these next two, and again you should be well up to it. These are both curves, so you'll just sweep around the bottom side of this shape, and then start again from the other side. And again, if you need to turn your paper rather than using your knife like I am, that's fine. Just stop and reposition your paper and do it again. With the last one, start with the smaller curve after you've cut the two side bits, and this should again pull out quite easily. And again, you can just press down on the shape near your knife to prevent paper tearing or from it getting away from you. Tackle this top side and then you are done. Pull it out, no need to go over the corners again, and we're set with that second row. Now I'm sure you can all guess how to go about the third row. You can go ahead and do it any way you want. Again, I suggest starting with the parallel lines. I've sped up the video because you don't really need to see me cut all of these. This is just so you can look and see in case you have any questions. Again, sometimes you might need to cut more at the corners again. That's usually where we find out that we haven't made as clean a slice through the paper as we thought we would. Sometimes, like there, you find out that you forgot to cut a line entirely, which is sometimes the downside of doing it with parallel lines. You might forget something you did or didn't do. Now with the star on the end, you can do it in any way that seems easiest to you. In this case, there's not really a lot of help in doing all of the parallel lines because they're all just equidistant from each other as you go round. You just need to be careful that as you get towards the end of this shape, you don't tear it because it is a little bit thin. So just go at it and approach it any way you want. And we're done. Now we'll do these last shapes. I'll show you how to approach some text, and we will move on to Jake the picnicking squirrel. These last shapes are a bit of a mix and match. Again, you should know how to take care of this triangle quite easily. And this other shape, sort of half circle if you will. Again, just follow around those curves. This one's a little bit steeper than the previous one. So again, just follow the curve. When it gets too much, then just keep going after turning the paper. There you go. And now the last bit is this little lightning bolt. Again, is just a multiple series of parallel lines. You can see here, you just tackle one after the other. Just being careful not to cut over too much. Depending on what you're using the paper cutting for, you might actually want this shape. It's a cute little Harry Potter-esque type thing. So in this last shape, it's a little bit more difficult, particularly because there's very tight curves. So first take the straight lines, and then just follow along about halfway through each of these curves. And rather like the parallel lines, I'm following through with the half curve on each one of these shapes. Just go around till you can't quite turn anymore. Be careful not to put too much pressure on your blade or on your wrist. And then turn the paper and go the other way to complete these. And you should feel a sort of little snick or catch when you cut through the bit of paper. You'll start to develop a muscle sense for when you've done it if you can't quite see it. See? Just pulls right up. And then you'll just do the same thing on the other side, again tackling it through about halfway. Again, you can try and take it all the way through, but you'll probably tear the paper or your blade. If you're finding you're having a lot of trouble with this, you might consider that you're pushing into the mat too much. Again, you're not trying to cut into the mat. The mat is simply a surface that accepts the blade. So if you ever have trouble with these, just be cautious and wary about how hard you're pressing. Again, it can be a little bit difficult sometimes to remember quite where you cut, but just go back through. And if you can't remember, it'll be very obvious when you try and pick up the shape itself. There we go. Now I mentioned previously the possibility of using a circle cutter. And as we get to this circle, you can use one of those swiveling headed knives as I had shown you in the beginning, or you can use a knife as I'm going to do it now. So usually the best way to do this is to cut in segments around the circle and the circumference. And once you've reached a point where it feels uncomfortable, you then turn the page. Generally a quarter of the circumference of the circle is about all you can accomplish. I tend to find that maybe a sixth is best. And you just slowly follow it around, and every time Once you get to this point right about here where it's too much, then you just rotate the paper. You can gently, if you wish, rotate the paper while the knife is still in it on the mat, using it sort of as a pivot, but you do risk tearing it. It is very difficult to get a perfect circle without any sort of mechanical cutter. Some people prefer to use punches, so they're set exactly for a specific diameter or circumference of circle, and they just punch them out of the paper. But this is the best way you can do it by hand. Particularly for large circles, this is a really good approach. Feel free to print out several of these and practice with the circles, as they're quite difficult. This is where you will see your practice coming through if you keep doing this. And you can occasionally just tidy up that circle if you wish. And I think that's pretty decent. Don't worry if yours doesn't look like that. Again, lots of practice. With the smaller circles, there are a couple of ways to approach them. You can either do as we've just done, or you can do as I'm doing here, where you slice them into sort of pie wedges, if you will. And then you just sort of slightly go around the edges, and this allows you to cut out a much tinier circle much more delicately. You can usually use this for the eyes of things. Usually they're even smaller than this, but to give you an idea, this is just a smaller circle. See, I've cut into about pizza wedges, really, so little eighths. And then you'll just choose a starting point, insert your knife, and then just gradually go around. And you can just flick away the pieces as you complete them. You can see this is a little bit more difficult. Some people find it easier. It's simply another option. If this doesn't work as well for you, feel free to try the regular way, just slowly going around the circumference. I guarantee, though, this will be useful to you if you ever have very, very tiny circles. And in our last project with Jake, you will use this technique to cut out what is a very tiny eye. You can go ahead and finish this one up, and then complete the second small circle in any way that you feel works best for you. All right, let's tackle the text. So I've provided this for you. I'm going to cut it out from the front. Here's the O. There are two ways to cut out shapes like this. You can either leave in that center bit, or you can cut them out entirely. I'm going to start with showing you how to essentially make it like a stencil. So you add in these two thin little strips at the top and bottom, and make sure not to cut through them, because that will hold your centerpiece in place. And at the very end, I'll then cut it out, and you can see what it looks like without that center bit in place. There are really two ways to handle text like this, where the actual center of the letter, like the R or the A, exists, or like the O here. You can either leave the center in or cut it out. Now you can follow along. These again are gentle curves. You should be able to handle them by now. Just make sure you don't cut out that thin center strip you've put in. Follow around the outside edge and then go for the interior. Now with the rest of this, one of the ways to tackle it is to simply go through and cut across all of the parallel lines on all of the letters to just make a start while you've got the paper positioned like this. Boom. Now, you can start with the it. Very simple, again, squares, rectangles, and just tiny curves. Even though the letters are smaller, they're still easy to go. Sometimes if your knife blade is a little bit smaller, you can't see the end of it, it might be a little bit harder to make the smaller shapes. Whereas this blade that I'm using here is quite long, and so it's very easy to see where it's going. Excellent, we're all done. It is now cut out. Look at that, doesn't that look great? So text again is just the same shapes as everything else. And I promised I'd show you what it looked like when you cut out the last of the O. So here is what that looks like with the stencil letter. Okay. And now if we were to go and cut it out, this is what the O looks like without the interior. And again, this is a matter of preference and choice. I tend to like it when everything is much more letter-like. Thank you so much for joining me in this introduction to paper cutting techniques. Now let's take everything you've learned and tackle Jake the picnicking squirrel. Welcome to your final project. By now you should have a good grasp on basic paper cutting techniques and how to approach different shapes in a paper cut. I've created this template of Jake the Squirrel to show you how you can use paper cutting to create art. If you don't already have this template, simply go to the class, click on the class project tab beneath the videos, and print off the template in whatever size is right for you. I've provided an 8.5 by 11 and an A4. After you've printed it out, you can trim away these edges, or you can keep it whole. I just like to start by trimming away the edges because it makes me feel like I've accomplished something. We're going to tackle this in 3 different parts. You can see this one here, and this one there. With paper cuts, it's very important to break it into smaller pieces. It's very hard to remove all of the negative space at once, particularly in a shape like this, where there are little bits like the leaves which tend to catch because the paper fits so well together. So the first bit I did is to cut a little section off where the branch does not meet the edge of the page so that I can remove it like this. And it's important that you approach this systematically so that you can follow along and not tear the paper. So I tend to approach it either from the center outwards, which I would do in a more complicated pattern, or something like this where I go around and just remove in segments. You can follow along on any of these leaves and just remove each segment as you go, so long as you proceed to the one next to it. Paper has a great integrity so long as you approach it properly. Now with these leaves, you can cut them out exactly as I have, or you can change them up. You can make them rounder or pointier. They're just quick leaves that I drew, so do whatever you think looks best. Now go ahead and cut out the rest of these leaves, and I will show you when you get there how to approach the hollow in the tree. The first part of the hollow in the tree is just a circle like any of the other ones you've done. So again, just be careful and sweep round the edge, and then turn your paper and keep going until you've completed that. Again, make sure you're not pressing too hard into the mat. It makes circles very difficult if you do. And then to get the sort of depth in the other thin line I've pointed out to you, you're just going to pierce with your knife just a tiny bit into the paper at each edge. So watch how I do it. Just like this. Just press in, and again, just a little press. You make sure you don't want to push it in any farther than the width of that. And then very gently go around. And if you need to, you can put your nail down on that thin piece of paper to try and avoid tearing it. And if you do, it doesn't matter, but just try. And you should, if your knife is sharp enough, be able just to pluck that right out. Like that. So you've done it. Excellent. That's probably one of the more difficult things you've had to do so far in this class. So let's finish out the rest of the tree branches. Now as you approach Jake, it's the little details like the fur, the slope of the back and the ears, which really bring a paper cut silhouette to life. So gently go around and make sure to capture those. Now with Jake's eye, you're going to end up making two curves, one right around the top and then one right around the pupil. And then you should be able just to pop it right out. And with the mouth, again, approach it the same way you did the hollow of the tree, just by pressing the point of your blade in at each edge of his mouth, and then once where his mouth meets the rest of the gray area, and then slide your blade along.